The radio crackle came at 3:47 hours, and it wasn't supposed to exist. Deep in the Panjshir Valley, where satellite coverage flickered like dying stars and communication windows lasted seconds, someone was screaming. Not the disciplined, clipped urgency of trained operators, but the raw sound of men who'd accepted death and found it unacceptable after all. The operations center at Bagram went silent. 47 people stopped breathing as the transmission cut through layers of encryption that should have made it impossible. Any station, this is Anvil 2 actual. We are 9 souls, ammunition black, 4-liter urgent. They know where we are. They're coming up the ridge now. We have maybe 12 minutes before. Static consumed the rest, but everyone heard what wasn't said. 12 minutes wasn't an estimate. It was a countdown. The SEAL team had been inserted 72 hours earlier, hunting a high-value target who'd orchestrated attacks across 3 provinces. The mission was supposed to be surgical, fast insertion, faster extraction. But the mountains had their own mathematics. A rockslide blocked the primary exfiltration point. A shepherd boy saw something he shouldn't have. An encrypted phone call went out before they could stop it. Now 9 Americans were pinned on a ridge with names they'd never chosen, waiting for an enemy that outnumbered them 15-1. The nearest quick reaction force was 38 minutes out. The AC-130 gunship that should have been on station had diverted for a mechanical issue. Every asset, every calculation, every backup plan had failed simultaneously in the way that only war can orchestrate. At Kandahar Airfield, Captain Ray Viper Cowery was walking away from her aircraft when the alert came. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II had been grounded for a hydraulic inspection that morning, paperwork and protocols that couldn't be rushed. But there's a difference between what's supposed to happen and what does happen when someone whispers that Americans are dying. She'd been in country for 7 months, flying close air support missions that earned grudging nods but never real respect. The A-10 community was small, and the combat aviation world smaller. She'd proven herself competent, reliable, professional, all the words that damn with faint praise. Her call sign had been given ironically after a mission where she'd talked an infantry unit through a danger-close strike with a calmness that unnerved everyone listening. Viper. Cold-blooded. The kind of nickname that's meant to keep you at a distance. The maintenance chief looked at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. "Ma'am, we haven't finished the inspection. She's not cleared for flight." Ray's eyes went to the aircraft, then to the clock, then back to the chief. In that sequence, something was decided that would be analyzed in after-action reports for years. She didn't raise her voice because she never needed to. "How much hydraulic fluid did you add?" 6 quarts, but leak rate? Negligible, maybe a quart per flight hour, but regulations. So I have 6 hours before it becomes critical. That's not how this works, Captain. There are procedures. Ray was already moving toward the aircraft. The chief followed, his clipboard becoming a shield against the decision he knew was coming. She turned to face him, and her voice carried the weight of something that had nothing to do with rank. "There are 9 men on a mountain who have 12 minutes, maybe 10 now. They don't have procedures. They have what we give them." The chief's jaw worked silently. He'd been in the Air Force for 19 years, and he'd learned that regulations existed because people died when they were ignored. He'd also learned that people died when they weren't ignored. It was the paradox that kept him awake some nights. Finally, he stepped aside, and his hand moved in a gesture that wasn't quite a salute, wasn't quite a surrender. "Flight controls are your responsibility, ma'am." They always were, Chief. Ray climbed into the cockpit while crew members appeared from nowhere, moving with the choreographed urgency of people who understood what unspoken orders meant. The A-10 was ugly in the way that scared beautiful things. 30 feet of titanium bathtub wrapped around a cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds designed to kill tanks. It was slow, ungainly, designed in an era when people still believed close air support meant being close enough to see faces. Modern fighter jockeys called it the Warthog with a mix of affection and pity. Ray called it honest. The engine spooled up with a sound like controlled violence, and she ran through her pre-flight checks with a speed that would have horrified any instructor. But instructors lived in a world where time was measured in procedures. She lived in a world where it was measured in bleeding. The tower cleared her without the usual banter. Everyone knew. The base had that particular quality of suspended silence that descends when something is happening that can't be acknowledged but can't be ignored. She taxied to the runway, and the A-10's nose pointed toward mountains that held secrets and bodies in equal measure. The takeoff roll was clean, textbook perfect, and then she was climbing into darkness that was just beginning to consider becoming dawn. The instruments glowed green, painting her face in the color of old radar screens and older decisions. The radio came alive as she leveled off. Viper 11, Kandahar Tower. Be advised, you're not on the air tasking order for this sector. Confirm mission authorization. She keyed the mic. Tower Viper 11, I have emergency tasking from. She stopped. There was no emergency tasking. There was only the memory of a voice that had stopped screaming. Tower, I'm declaring emergency authority under. Viper 11, negative. You need proper authorization. Return to base for mission brief. The mountains were getting closer, dark shapes against a sky that couldn't decide if it was night or morning. Somewhere in those mountains, 9 men were counting bullets in minutes. She thought about the last letter she'd written home, sealed in the footlocker under her bunk. She thought about her father, who'd flown Phantoms over North Vietnam and never talked about it except once, when he'd told her that the only thing worse than dying for a mistake was living after failing to prevent one. She thought about the radio silence that would follow if she turned back now. Tower Viper 11. I'm proceeding to last known coordinates of Anvil 2 actual. I'll accept full responsibility for this deviation. The response was immediate and cold. Viper 11, you are ordered to return to base immediately. This is a direct order from Colonel Ravitch. Acknowledge. She switched frequencies. Somewhere ahead, men were dying. Somewhere behind, officers were deciding how to spin this. She knew which one mattered. The terrain rolled beneath her in shades of gray and black, mountains that had been killing invaders since before Alexander. The A-10's radar warning receiver was silent. No SAMs, no AAA, just the ancient danger of rocks and gravity. She armed her weapons systems, the switches clicking with a finality that had nothing to do with sound. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon held 1,100 rounds. Each one weighed nearly a pound. Together, they could chew through armor, concrete, and the thin veneer of civilization that separated soldiers from savages. She'd fired them before, felt the aircraft shudder as the gun produced more recoil than the engines produced thrust. It was like riding a dragon that kept trying to fly backward. The radio crackled on the emergency frequency. Any station, any static, there at the wire, static, need immediate, more static than nothing. Ray pushed the throttles forward, knowing it wouldn't matter, knowing she had to try anyway. The A-10 wasn't built for speed. It was built to arrive and stay, to circle like a metal angel of very specific and terrible judgment. But even angels can be late. She checked her fuel. Enough for 90 minutes on station, less if she had to maneuver hard. The weapons panel glowed ready. AGM-65 Mavericks Hydra rockets the gun. Enough to ruin someone's day comprehensively. Not enough to change the math of 15-to-1 odds. She thought about ratios and firepower and the way training never quite prepared you for the moment when theory became bodies. A voice crackled through, different frequency, different tone. Aircraft approaching Panjshir sector from the south, identify yourself. This is restricted airspace. You are in violation of. This is Captain Cowery, call sign Viper 11, responding to troops in contact. Viper 11, we have no record of your authorization. You need to. She cut the transmission and switched back to the emergency frequency. Anvil 2 actual, this is Viper 11. I'm an A-10, 5 minutes from your position. I need your location and enemy disposition. Silence. The kind that meant either radios were dead or people were. She checked her coordinates against the last known position, a grid reference that had been transmitted before the world went wrong. The ridge was visible now, a knife edge of rock separating valleys that had their own microclimates and histories of violence. She dropped to 5,000 feet, low enough to see detail, high enough to avoid small arms fire from anyone who wasn't very lucky or very skilled. The first light of dawn was touching the eastern peaks, and in that light she saw smoke. Not the thick black smoke of burning fuel, but the thin gray wisps of small fires, fighting positions. She counted 6, maybe 7, arranged in a semicircle around a position on the ridge. The SEALs would be in the center, rocks and whatever cover they'd managed. The enemy would be coming from 3 sides, using fire and maneuver, taking time because they had it and the Americans didn't. It was the kind of tactical situation that ended one way unless something changed the equation. She was here to be that something, unauthorized and probably court-martialed, but here. The radio hissed, "Viper, this is Anvil 2, we're down to 4 effective. If you're real, we need danger close, how copy?" His voice was steady, which meant he was either very brave or past the point where fear mattered. Danger close meant she'd be firing within 600 meters of friendly forces. Meant the margin for error was measured in seconds, and angles that had to be perfect. Anvil 2, solid copy. I need you to mark your position. What do you have? Strobes IR only, no smoke. Infrared strobes would be invisible to the naked eye, visible only through night vision. Except dawn was coming, and her night vision was already washing out in the growing light. She'd have to rely on GPS coordinates and trust that 9 men pinned on a ridge could give her numbers accurate enough to drop ordnance within the length of a football field without killing them all. Send your grids. The numbers came through, coordinates in the military grid reference system that reduced the world to 10-digit precision. She punched them into her targeting system and compared them to the topography. The ridge matched. She could see the general area but not the specific position. In the growing light, everything looked like rock and more rock, the kind of terrain that made mockery of million-dollar targeting systems. She'd have to do this the old way, the way pilots had done it when bombs were dumb and courage was the only smart weapon available. She rolled in, descending toward the ridge in a run that would bring her within range of anything bigger than a rifle. The first tracer fire reached toward her when she was at 3,500 feet. Green lines drawing geometry in the air, too slow to catch her but fast enough to show that someone down there had a heavy machine gun and the skill to use it. She jinked left, then right, keeping her flight path unpredictable while her eyes scanned the terrain. There, a cluster of shapes that moved wrong, too organized to be rocks. Enemy positions on the northern approach, maybe 40 fighters spread across 200 meters. And there, further south, the thin smoke of a fighting position under sustained fire. That would be the SEALs, holding ground because they had nowhere else to go. She keyed the radio. Anvil 2, Viper 1-1 is in hot, guns on the northern concentration. Keep your heads down. Copy that, Viper. God bless the Air Force. She almost smiled at that, almost. Then she rolled inverted, pulled the nose through, and lined up on the enemy position with a patience that belied the fact that she was flying at 250 knots toward people who wanted her dead. The gun's sights centered. The range clicked down, 1,200 meters, 1,800. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger spoke with a voice that was less sound than physical presence. BRRRRRRRT. 2 seconds, 60 rounds, each one a spear of depleted uranium traveling at 3,400 feet per second. The aircraft shuddered, bucked, slowed as if she'd thrown out an anchor. Below, the ground erupted in a line of dust and fire and flying rock. She pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces press her into the seat, watching the tracers follow her climb, always a second behind, always too late. Her heart hammered, and her hands were steady, and somewhere in the space between those two facts was the person she'd become. Anvil 2, how'd we do? Static then. Viper, you just bought us breathing room. Northern approach is neutralized. But we've got more coming from the west, maybe 20 fighters moving up the draw. She banked left, gaining altitude, thinking through the geometry. The western approach would put them in a narrow valley, bunched up, perfect for rockets. But it would also put her in a flight path that paralleled the ridge, exposed to fire from 3 directions. The kind of run that got aircraft killed. She checked her fuel, her weapons, her options. Then she pushed the throttles forward and dove back toward the mountains that had been swallowing armies since the Bronze Age collapsed. The Hydra rockets left their pods in pairs, trailing smoke as they arced downward toward coordinates she'd calculated in her head and confirmed with instruments that were older than she was. The explosions walked up the valley in a line of fire that turned morning into something ancient and biblical. She didn't wait to see the results, already pulling up, already scanning for the next threat. The radio was alive now, voices overlapping, command wanting to know what was happening, other aircraft checking in, the whole machinery of modern war trying to catch up to a decision that had been made in the seconds between hearing a scream and deciding it mattered. All stations, this is Havoc 26. We're an Apache flight inbound to Anvil 2's position, 15 minutes out. 15 minutes. She checked the time. Dawn was coming faster now, light spilling over the peaks like water finding its level. In 15 minutes, the Apache would arrive with their sophisticated sensors and coordinated fires. In 15 minutes, the situation would be resolved by people who'd followed proper procedures and filled out the right forms. In 15 minutes, the 9 men on the ridge might be 7 or 4 or memories. She had to buy them those 15 minutes, had to stay on station and keep the enemy's head down while backup arrived. It was simple math, the kind that didn't care about hydraulic leaks or unauthorized missions or the fact that her career was probably ending with every trigger pull. Another pass, this time from the south, rockets and guns on a concentration of fighters who'd been smart enough to use a dead space in the terrain for cover, not smart enough to expect someone crazy enough to come in that low, that slow, that determined. The rockets found them, and the gun finished the work, and she pulled up through tracers that seemed to chase her like disappointed promises. Viper 1-1, this is Havoc 2-6. We have you visual. That was some mighty fine shooting. You can RTB now, we'll take it from here. She circled once more, eyes on the ridge where 9 men had become 8 and then maybe 7 but were still breathing, still fighting. The Apache flight was visible now, 2 black shapes moving fast and low, modern and lethal and everything the A-10 wasn't. She should leave, should return to base and face whatever consequences were waiting, should let the professionals handle it. Instead, she made one more pass, slower this time, checking for threats the Apache might miss, buying seconds that probably didn't matter but might, because war was built on seconds that might. Only when she was satisfied, only when the Apache were on station and the enemy was running, only then did she turn south toward Kandahar and whatever waited there. The flight back was quiet. The radio had gone silent except for the professional chatter of people coordinating the extraction, calling in medevac, securing the area. She wasn't part of that conversation anymore. She'd done her part, the unauthorized, reckless, probably illegal part, and now she was just a pilot flying a damaged aircraft back to explain herself to people who'd never understand because they'd never been there, never heard that scream on the radio. She landed as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, touching down with a gentleness that her crew chief would later say was the mark of someone who knew she'd pushed her luck far enough. The A-10 taxied to its spot, and she shut down the engines, and in the sudden silence, she could hear her heart still racing, still trying to catch up to decisions that had been made somewhere beyond thought, in the place where training and character and something unnameable all met and made a choice that couldn't be unmade. Colonel Ravitch was waiting when she climbed down. He was a tall man with eyes that had seen too much and a jaw set in the permanent clench of someone who'd spent 30 years making impossible decisions. He didn't speak immediately, just looked at her, then at the aircraft, then at the gun barrels that were still warm enough to shimmer the air. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was carefully neutral. "Captain Cowery, my office. Now." She followed him across the ramp, aware of the eyes watching, the whispers starting. By evening, everyone on base would know. By morning, it would be in official reports. By next week, she'd either be decorated or court-martialed, and probably both. The colonel's office was cool and dark after the brightness of the flight line. He closed the door and stood for a long moment with his back to her, looking at a map of Afghanistan that covered most of one wall. When he turned, his expression was unreadable. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have any idea how many regulations you violated?" "Several, sir." "Do you have any idea how much paperwork this is going to generate?" "No, sir." He stared at her, and something like a smile touched his face, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. 9 men are alive right now who wouldn't be if you'd followed procedure. The SEALs are already asking who Viper is. The Apache pilots are saying they've never seen flying like that from an A-10. And I have to write a report that somehow explains why one of my pilots took an aircraft that wasn't cleared for flight, violated restricted airspace, and engaged without proper authorization. He sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. "What do you want me to say, Captain?" She stood at attention, eyes forward, voice steady. "The truth, sir." "The truth," he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The truth is complicated. The truth is that you saved lives by breaking rules that exist to save lives. The truth is that you made me look bad by making the right call when I made the wrong one. The truth is—" He stopped, rubbed his face. "The truth is I don't know whether to pin a medal on you or ground you permanently." "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted." "I'd do it again." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Finally, he nodded. "I know, that's what worries me, and that's also why." He picked up a folder from his desk, opened it, scanned the contents. "The SEALs are requesting you as dedicated CAS for the rest of their deployment. The wing commander is furious. The general is intrigued. And I'm stuck in the middle trying to figure out if you're the best pilot I have or the most dangerous." "Can I be both, sir?" This time the smile stayed longer. "Get out of my office, Captain. You're grounded pending investigation. And if you ever pull something like this again, I'll ground you so hard you'll be flying a desk until you're eligible for retirement. Understood?" "Yes, sir." She saluted and left, walking back across the base toward her quarters. The sun was fully up now, and the day was beginning its routine of heat and dust, and the thousand small tasks that kept a war running. People nodded as she passed, a few with respect, a few with curiosity, most with the careful neutrality of those who didn't want to be associated with either success or failure until it was clear which way the wind was blowing. She didn't care. She'd done what needed doing, and the rest was just noise. The bureaucratic aftermath of a decision made in seconds, but that would be analyzed for months. That night, alone in her quarters, she pulled out the letter she'd written home and tore it up, started a new one. The words came harder now, weighted with things she couldn't say and wouldn't if she could. She settled for the basics. "I'm fine. The flying is challenging. I miss you." The things people wrote when they couldn't write the truth but needed to write something. She sealed it and set it aside, then lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling, thinking about radio calls and tracers and the moment when you decide that some rules matter less than the lives they're meant to protect. Sleep came slowly, filled with the sound of engines and guns, and a voice that had stopped screaming because someone had answered. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of statements and counter-statements, of technical experts arguing about hydraulic systems and tactical experts arguing about rules of engagement. 3 weeks of sitting in a room and explaining decisions that had been made in seconds to people who had hours to consider them and still couldn't agree. The SEALs sent a letter through their chain of command. The maintenance chief submitted a report that was carefully worded to emphasize that the aircraft had been airworthy, just not technically cleared. The Apache pilots gave statements that praised her flying and implicitly questioned why she'd been the only one there. In the end, it came down to Colonel Ravitch, who sat across from a board of senior officers and explained that sometimes the right decision and the proper decision weren't the same thing, and that he'd rather have officers who knew the difference than ones who didn't. The verdict was typically military, neither absolution nor condemnation but something in between. No court-martial but a letter of reprimand in her file, no medal but no grounding either. She was free to fly, with the understanding that she'd used up whatever goodwill her actions had earned and then some. It was the kind of outcome that satisfied no one and annoyed everyone, which meant it was probably fair. She accepted it without comment and went back to flying, back to missions that were properly authorized and correctly executed, back to being a competent, reliable, professional pilot who never quite fit into the boxes people tried to put her in. But something had changed. She noticed it in small ways, the way other pilots looked at her in the briefing room, the way ground controllers responded when she checked in, the way her call sign was spoken with a different inflection. Viper. Not ironic anymore, not a joke about being cold-blooded. Something else. Something earned. She didn't know if she liked it, didn't know if she wanted the responsibility of living up to whatever myth was being built around a few minutes of unauthorized flying. But she wore it anyway, because that's what you did with names you didn't choose. You carried them and tried to make them mean what you needed them to mean. The months passed in the rhythm of deployment. Missions and maintenance, boredom and terror, the slow erosion of normalcy that came from living in a place where violence was always 3 minutes away. She flew close air support for infantry units pinned down in valleys whose names she'd never remember. She provided overwatch for convoys threading through passes that had been ambush sites since the Silk Road. She logged hours in the cockpit and hours on the ground, and slowly the war became something she carried inside rather than something she went to. Other pilots rotated home, their deployments complete. New ones arrived, wide-eyed and eager and not yet aware of how much they'd change. She stayed, extended her tour once, then again, because going home meant explaining to people who couldn't understand why she'd rather be here, in the heat and dust and danger, than anywhere safe and comfortable and meaningless. The second time she saved a ground unit, it was almost routine. A patrol caught in an ambush, enemy in prepared positions, the usual math of firepower and desperation. She was on station in 12 minutes, properly authorized this time, and she worked the target area with a precision that came from practice and something deeper, a understanding of what those voices on the radio meant when they asked for help. The pilot flying her wing was new, a lieutenant fresh from training, and after they'd expended their ordnance and the ground unit was secure, he came up on the radio with a voice full of awe. "Viper, that was. I've never seen. How did you know where to put the rounds?" She didn't answer immediately, thinking about how to explain something that was part training, part intuition, and part the memory of a voice that had stopped screaming. Finally, she keyed the mic. "You listen to what they're not saying. You look at what they can't show you, and you remember that every second you waste is a second someone's dying. That's all." "That's all," he repeated, like she'd revealed some secret of the universe instead of stating the obvious. Maybe to him it was. Maybe everyone had to learn in their own time that war was simple until it wasn't, and that the distance between those two states was measured in lives that couldn't be retrieved once they were lost. She didn't say any of this. She just led him back to base, debriefed the mission with the economy of words that came from having done it too many times, and moved on to the next day, the next mission, the next chance to be useful in a place where usefulness was measured in how many people went home breathing. The story spread anyway, the way stories do in the military. Embellished, simplified, turned into something that fit the shape people needed it to fit. The female pilot who'd broken the rules to save the SEALs. The A-10 driver who'd gone danger close when everyone else was too far away. Viper, who'd earned her call sign twice over. She heard fragments of it in the chow hall, in the briefing rooms, passed along in tones that ranged from admiration to resentment to simple curiosity. She never corrected anyone, never confirmed or denied, just flew her missions and tried not to think about the distance between what she'd done and what people said she'd done. The truth was complicated. The story was simple. People preferred simple. Her father wrote her a letter. It arrived on a day when she was weathered in, too much dust in the air for flying, nothing to do but wait and think and remember why she was here. The letter was brief in the way of men who'd learned to carry too much in too few words. He didn't mention her unauthorized flight, didn't ask about the investigation. Just wrote, "Your mother says you're doing well. I think you're doing what you have to do. That's not always the same thing. Come home when you can. Come home whole if you're able. But come home knowing you did what mattered." She read it 3 times, then put it in the footlocker with the other things that mattered. The letter she'd written and never sent. The wings her grandfather had worn in World War II. A photograph of a younger version of herself who hadn't yet learned that courage and fear were the same thing viewed from different angles. The deployment ended the way all deployments end. Not with a climax, but with a gradual winding down. A slow return to routines that felt normal, until you realized they were just preparing you for the moment when you'd leave and wonder if anything you did had mattered. She flew her last mission on a clear day, escorting a convoy through terrain that stayed quiet, the kind of flight where nothing happened and everyone went home, and you were grateful for the boredom. On the landing, she caught herself looking at the mountains one last time, thinking about all the valleys and ridges and places where people had fought and died over ground that looked the same no matter who held it. Then she taxied in, shut down the engines, and climbed out for the last time in this deployment, this war, this chapter of a story that she was still writing one mission at a time. The flight home was long and uncomfortable, full of people trying to sleep and failing, trying to process what they'd seen and done and become. She sat by a window and watched the landscape change beneath her, mountains to desert to ocean to the geometric patterns of civilization that looked alien after months of terrain that followed older rules. She thought about the 9 men on the ridge, wondered if they'd made it home, if they thought about that morning, if they knew her name beyond a call sign. She thought about the lieutenant who'd asked how she knew where to put the rounds, wondered if he'd figure it out or if some questions only answered themselves through repetition. She thought about her father's letter, about coming home whole, and realized that wholeness wasn't about being unchanged, but about being able to carry the changes without letting them break you. The homecoming was awkward in the way these things always were. People who wanted to hear stories she couldn't tell, people who didn't want to hear anything at all, the careful dance of reintegration into a world that had kept spinning while she'd been gone. Her father met her at the airport, and they embraced without words, the kind of hug that said everything that needed saying and nothing that would make it harder. Her mother cried, which was expected, and asked if she was okay, which was unanswerable, and then made her favorite meal, which was the kind of gesture that meant more than words ever could. They sat around a table that was too clean, in a house that was too quiet, and tried to pretend that the distance between them was only measured in miles and months rather than in experiences that couldn't be translated. That night, lying in a bed that was too soft, in a room that was too silent, she stared at the ceiling and thought about a ridge in Afghanistan where 9 men had counted minutes until an aircraft they shouldn't have heard had arrived because someone had decided rules mattered less than lives. She thought about the sound of the gun, the arc of the rockets, the moment when chaos resolved into something that looked almost like order. She thought about whether she'd do it again, knowing the cost, knowing the consequences, knowing that every choice was a door closing on other possibilities. And she knew, with the certainty that had guided her through that unauthorized flight, that she would. Not because she was brave, not because she was reckless, but because some decisions transcended the mathematics of regulation and career, and the only unforgivable thing was knowing what needed to be done and choosing comfort over action. Sleep came eventually, shallow and troubled, full of radio voices and tracer fire and the persistent sound of engines that wouldn't shut down even when the aircraft was safely parked thousands of miles away. She woke before dawn, a habit that wouldn't break, and watched the sun rise over a landscape that held no enemies, no targets, no urgent need for violence. It should have been peaceful. It felt empty instead, like a sentence with the most important words removed. She got up, went for a run, pushed herself until her lungs burned and her legs ached, and the distance between who she'd been and who she'd become felt manageable. Then she showered, dressed, and began the next phase, figuring out how to be a person who'd done extraordinary things in a world that valued the ordinary. The Air Force had other plans. They always did. Within a week of her return, she was informed that she'd been selected for a tactics instructor position, training new pilots in close air support. It was an honor, a recognition of skill, and also a way of keeping her where she could do the most good without the risk of another unauthorized flight embarrassing the chain of command. She accepted because accepting was what you did, and because teaching felt like a way of passing along something that mattered, even if she wasn't sure what that something was. The assignment started in 3 months, enough time to decompress, to reconnect, to pretend she was adjusting when really she was just waiting for the next thing that would make sense of the last thing. She spent those months in a kind of limbo, not quite civilian, not quite deployed, existing in the space between worlds. She visited her grandfather's grave, stood in the silence of the cemetery, and tried to articulate a connection that felt important but remained just beyond words. She went to an A-10 reunion, met pilots who'd flown the aircraft in Desert Storm and Kosovo and Iraq, heard stories that echoed her own with different names and dates, but the same essential truth: that sometimes the old, ugly, unloved aircraft arrived when nothing else could, and that counted for more than elegance or speed or any of the metrics modern war thought important. She listened to these stories and said nothing about her own, but the way the older pilots looked at her suggested they knew anyway, that the story had spread even here, that she'd become part of a tradition she was still learning to understand. The tactics instructor position started on a Monday in April, in Nevada, where the sky was huge and empty, and the air was so clear you could see forever. She reported to a squadron full of young pilots who looked at her with a mix of respect and curiosity, wondering what made her qualified to teach them anything they didn't already know. She didn't try to explain. She just flew with them, showed them what close air support looked like when you did it right, when you listened to the voices on the radio, and understood that every mission was personal to someone even if it was routine to you. She taught them to read terrain, to anticipate threats, to make decisions quickly and live with them forever. And slowly, over missions and debriefs and late-night conversations in the bar that became the real classroom, they began to understand that she wasn't teaching tactics so much as philosophy, that the aircraft was just a tool, that the weapons were just means, and that what mattered was the willingness to show up when showing up was hard and dangerous and possibly career-ending. One evening, after a particularly challenging training mission, a young captain named Hayes approached her. He was good, talented, the kind of pilot who made it look easy and therefore didn't understand how hard it was. He'd gotten frustrated during the mission, unable to find the target in the way she described, unable to make the shot in the window available. Now he stood in front of her with questions written on his face and pride keeping them unspoken. She waited, letting the silence stretch until finally he broke. "Ma'am, how did you know? During the mission you said the target would be in that draw, and I looked and couldn't see anything, and then you rolled in and there it was. How did you know?" She thought about the ridge in Afghanistan, about patterns in terrain, about the way people moved when they were hunting and when they were hunted. She thought about all the missions that had taught her to see what